The roar of waves crashed against the rugged Pacific Islands. Amid the chaos of gunfire, explosions, and desperate calls, one voice carried messages that no enemy could decode. It wasn't a machine, nor a cryptic device. It was a language spoken by a people whose words had never been written down, whose culture had survived centuries of oppression. One Navajo soldier's language became the unbreakable code that changed the Pacific War forever. For the men and women fighting on distant islands, it was a lifeline. For history, it was a hidden triumph waiting to be revealed. Welcome to Untold Golden History. Today we delve into a story that is as fascinating as it is heroic. The tale of the Navajo Code Talkers is not just a tale of war, it is a story of cultural resilience, intellectual ingenuity, and unparalleled bravery. These men, hailing from the Navajo Nation of the American Southwest, turned their native language into a tool that would confound enemy forces and save countless lives. Their courage, intellect, and unwavering commitment would ultimately alter the course of the Pacific War. World War II is often remembered for its monumental battles, daring strategies, and global consequences. But within that vast conflict, small, decisive acts, sometimes invisible to the naked eye, made enormous differences. Among these acts, the contributions of the Navajo Code Talkers stand out not just for their effectiveness, but for the remarkable human story behind the code. Section 1. The Mission. A Nation Needs a Secret. The Call to Service. By 1942, the United States was fully immersed in the global conflict of World War II. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 had thrust the nation into the Pacific theater, where battles raged across islands such as Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Iwo Jima. Communication across these distant islands was critical. Troop movements, artillery strikes, and supply chains depended on accurate, instantaneous transmission of orders. But radio transmissions could be intercepted, and the Japanese military had proven skilled in breaking codes. Every message sent over the airwaves carried risk. Lives hung in the balance. It was during this time that the U.S. Marine Corps faced a challenge. They needed a code that the Japanese could never break, a system that could withstand the enemy's sophisticated cryptographic attacks. Military planners considered various options, but conventional codes were either too slow to use under battlefield conditions or too vulnerable to decryption. Enter the Navajo people. The Navajo language, an untapped weapon. The Navajo Nation, located in the deserts and plateaus of Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah, was home to a people whose language was unlike any other spoken on Earth. Complex, tonal, and unwritten, Navajo had been passed down orally for generations. Its syntax, idioms, and structure were extraordinarily difficult for outsiders to understand, even for trained linguists. For the Marines, this presented a remarkable opportunity. In 1942, the U.S. Marine Corps began recruiting young Navajo men to develop a secret code. They were to take their native language, already a living testament to centuries of cultural preservation, and turn it into a military asset. These men, many in their late teens or early 20s, were suddenly thrust into a unique position. They were not just soldiers, they were cryptographers, linguists, and guardians of a code that could decide life or death on the battlefield. Origins of the Code Talker program. The Code Talker program officially began in 1942 at Camp Pendleton in California. Philip Johnston, a civil engineer who had grown up on a Navajo reservation and was fluent in the language, proposed the idea to the Marine Corps. Johnston had first-hand knowledge of the language's complexity and recognized its potential as an unbreakable code. After gaining approval for military leadership, recruitment began. The first group consisted of 29 Navajo men who would form the initial cadre of Code Talkers. Training was rigorous. Beyond standard Marine Corps boot camp, these men had to learn military terminology, develop a code book, and memorize hundreds of coded words that would replace standard military terms. For example, the word turtle represented a tank, and chicken hawk stood for a dive bomber. This coded vocabulary was intuitive for the Navajo speakers, but incomprehensible to anyone outside the group. It was a language within a language, layered with ingenuity and precision. Challenges of the mission. The mission was not without challenges. Many of the Navajo recruits came from rural, isolated communities and had never traveled far from their reservations. Suddenly, they were confronted with the harsh realities of military training, discipline, physical endurance, and strict hierarchy. Beyond the physical trials, there was a profound emotional burden. They were being asked to carry the hopes of the entire nation in a code that only they could understand and transmit accurately under extreme pressure. Yet the Code Talkers approached the challenge with determination. For them, service was a duty to their country, but it was also a testament to their resilience as a people who had survived forced relocation, cultural suppression, and centuries of marginalization. Their contribution would intertwine personal courage with collective history. Developing the code. Creating the code itself was an intellectual feat. The recruits had to convert ordinary military terminology into Navajo words, and then often into abbreviated phrases to ensure speed during transmission. The resulting code had multiple layers of encryption. Even if Japanese cryptographers recognized the language as Navajo, which they could not, they would still face a web of substitutions and context-specific meanings that made the messages indecipherable. The Code Talkers also developed a system to transmit longer, complex messages. Every letter, number, and common military term was assigned a Navajo equivalent. For example, the word submarine could be represented by iron fish. This allowed for rapid communication that could be broadcast across radios or telegraphs without risk of interception. Early deployment and testing. Before the Pacific Campaign, the Code Talkers underwent extensive field testing. They sent messages between bases, practiced under live fire simulations, and endured extreme weather conditions, from the scorching heat of the California deserts to the humid islands of the Pacific. Their success in these exercises convinced military commanders that the Navajo Code could be relied on under combat conditions. By early 1943, the Code Talkers were ready for deployment. Their first assignments would be in the thick of battle, where split-second communication could determine victory or defeat. Little did they know that their contributions would soon become legendary, shaping pivotal moments in some of the bloodiest conflicts of the Pacific Theater.
Section 2. Code in Action. The battlefield begins. Arrival in the Pacific. The transport ships cut through the vast Pacific, their decks crowded with anxious soldiers. Among them, the Navajo Code Talkers carried not only their packs and rifles, but an extraordinary burden, the language of their ancestors, transformed into a code no enemy could penetrate. For many, this was their first time leaving the desert landscapes of Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. The humid, tropical islands they were approaching were a stark contrast to their homeland. Dense jungles, swarming insects, and the constant roar of the ocean foreshadowed the intensity of the battles ahead. When the Code Talkers landed on Guadalcanal in early 1943, the reality of war hit immediately. Explosions echoed from nearby fronts. Marines and soldiers moved in urgent patterns, guided by officers shouting orders through megaphones. Amid the chaos, the Code Talkers began their work, transmitting encoded messages that would coordinate troop movements, artillery strikes, and supply lines. First messages under fire.
Imagine the tension as a young Navajo soldier leaned over a field radio, heart pounding, fingers flying across the transmitter. Every word mattered. Every message could mean the difference between life and death. The enemy was relentless, and yet no matter how frantically the Japanese tried to intercept or decode, the messages remained intelligible. The first successful combat transmissions proved the code's worth. Japanese forces, despite efforts by cryptographers and interrogators, could not penetrate the linguistic armor the Navajo had created. These early successes not only saved lives, but also provided a morale boost to the Marines, who realized they could rely on instant, secure communication in the midst of brutal island warfare. Heroism in every transmission. The Code Talkers' heroism was not only intellectual, but profoundly physical. They often had to transmit messages under fire, crawling through mud, ducking artillery shells, and navigating treacherous terrain. Some carried portable radios over miles of jungle, delivering critical messages to frontline commanders. Despite constant danger, the Code Talkers performed with calm precision, fully aware that any mistake could lead to disaster. At Tarawa, one of the bloodiest battles in the Pacific, Code Talkers relayed rapid-fire orders that helped Marines advance while minimizing friendly fire incidents. Japanese soldiers could never predict the next movement, and for the Americans, this gave a tactical edge that proved invaluable. Japanese confusion and frustration. The Japanese military, renowned for their code-breaking capabilities, found themselves baffled by the Navajo Code. Attempts to capture Code Talkers or coerce them into revealing the code failed. Even when some Japanese soldiers recognized the language as Navajo, the substitutions, abbreviations, and context-specific terms rendered it indecipherable. This linguistic complexity turned the tide in key battles, allowing the U.S. forces to communicate faster and more securely than ever before. Reports from commanders frequently praised the Code Talkers' work, noting the unprecedented speed and reliability of their transmissions. One general later wrote that the Navajo Code saved countless lives and shortened the war in the Pacific. This was no exaggeration. Their contributions directly influenced the success of operations across multiple islands, including Saipan, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima. Moments of personal bravery. While the code itself was their primary weapon, the men also displayed extraordinary courage. In one documented instance, a code talker under heavy fire continued to transmit messages while pinned down by enemy gunfire. His hands were shaking, sweat and blood mingling, yet he refused to stop. The message he sent enabled reinforcements to arrive just in time, preventing a massacre. These stories, repeated across islands and campaigns, exemplify a rare combination of intellectual prowess and battlefield bravery. The code expands. As the war progressed, the Code Talkers expanded the vocabulary of the code to accommodate new military technology and strategies. Aircraft, armored vehicles, artillery, and naval maneuvers all required precise terminology. This ongoing evolution ensured that even as the Japanese adapted their tactics, the code remained unbreakable. The Code Talkers were not just messengers, they were innovators, constantly refining a system that saved thousands of lives. Impact on the war effort. By 1944, the Navajo Code Talkers were integral to every major Pacific operation. Their ability to transmit orders in real time allowed the U.S. military to execute complex strategies with unprecedented efficiency. Key victories like the liberation of the Mariana Islands and the decisive Battle of Iwo Jima were made possible in part due to the secure, rapid communications maintained by the Code Talkers. Historians now recognize that these contributions were pivotal in shortening the war, reducing casualties, and preserving strategic advantages. Yet, despite their critical role, these men received little recognition at the time, often returning to civilian life quietly, their extraordinary service largely unknown to the public. emotional toll and camaraderie. The work was mentally and emotionally taxing. Code talkers often carried the weight of knowing that a single error could cost lives. Yet amidst the stress, bonds were formed. Shared heritage, shared purpose, and shared danger created a unique fraternity. Letters home reveal moments of humor and humanity, men who spoke the language of their ancestors, connecting to family and culture even while thousands of miles away from home. One code talker recounted how he would mentally recite Navajo prayers before transmitting under fire, grounding himself in tradition and faith. These personal rituals helped sustain them through the most harrowing moments of the war.
Section 3. Heroism Beyond the Battlefield. The war ends, but silence begins. In August 1945, the guns finally fell silent. The Pacific War was over. Japan surrendered, and across the United States, celebrations erupted. Soldiers returned home as heroes. Parades filled city streets. Medals were pinned. Names were printed in newspapers. But for the Navajo Code Talkers, the end of the war marked the beginning of a long, quiet silence. They were told to return home. They were told to say nothing. The code they had used, the code that had saved thousands of lives, was classified. The U.S. government ordered the Code Talkers to keep their wartime service secret. They could not tell their families what they had done. They could not explain where they had been or why. They could not speak of the battles, the radios, the messages sent under fire. For decades, their heroism would remain locked behind classified files. Coming home to a changed world. When the Navajo Code Talkers returned to their reservations, they came back as different men. They had crossed oceans, seen death on a scale few could imagine, and carried the weight of war in their memories. Yet the world they returned to had not changed in ways that honored their sacrifice. Many reservations still lacked electricity, running water, and basic infrastructure. Poverty was widespread. Employment opportunities were scarce. Some code talkers returned wearing their Marine uniforms only to face the same discrimination and marginalization they had known before the war. There were no parades waiting for them, no public ceremonies, no national recognition. In many cases, even their own families did not know what they had done. The psychological toll of secrecy. Silence has a cost. The Code Talkers carried vivid memories of combat, friends lost, close calls, moments where a single message meant survival or death. But because their work was classified, they had no outlet to share these experiences. This enforced secrecy compounded the psychological toll of war. Some suffered from what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. Nightmares, anxiety, and emotional withdrawal became common. Without recognition or understanding, many internalized their trauma, believing they had to bear it alone. One code talker later recalled, "I wanted to tell my father what I did. I wanted him to know why I was gone so long, but I couldn't. I had to keep it inside." For men raised in a culture that valued storytelling, oral history, and communal memory, this silence was especially painful. A dual identity. The Navajo Code Talkers lived with a dual identity. On the battlefield, they were essential, trusted, respected, relied upon. But back home, they were once again Native Americans living in a country that had long marginalized them. This contradiction cut deep. The same language that was discouraged or outright punished in boarding schools had become the military's most effective code. Many code talkers had been beaten as children for speaking Navajo in school. Yet during the war, that same language was celebrated as a strategic weapon. This irony was not lost on them. Their service forced a painful question.
How could a nation rely on their culture in wartime, yet ignore it in peace? Struggles to build a civilian life. After the war, many code talkers attempted to resume ordinary lives. Some became shepherds, craftsmen, or laborers. Others sought education through the GI Bill, though systemic barriers often limited their opportunities. Language barriers, lack of formal schooling, and discrimination made higher education difficult. Jobs promised to veterans were often inaccessible to Native Americans. Despite their service, many code talkers lived modestly, sometimes in poverty. And still, they remained silent. Their heroism existed only in classified reports and the memories of fellow Marines. Brotherhood that never faded. Though they rarely spoke publicly about their service, the bond between code talkers remained unbreakable. When they met, a glance or a few Navajo words were enough to reconnect. They shared a brotherhood forged not just in battle, but in secrecy. Reunions were rare but powerful. Stories were exchanged quietly, often in Navajo, away from outsiders. These moments allowed them to release years of unspoken emotion. For them, the code was more than a military tool. It was a shared legacy. The slow path toward recognition. It wasn't until 1968, more than 22 years after the war, that the Navajo Code Talker program was finally declassified. The world was at last allowed to know the truth. Even then, recognition came slowly. Historians began uncovering records, journalists published stories, veterans groups advocated for acknowledgement. But for many code talkers, years had already passed. Some had died without ever hearing the words, "Thank you," from the nation they served. When recognition did arrive, it was emotional and overwhelming. One code talker reportedly said, "We didn't do it for medals. We did it because our country needed us, but it feels good to finally be seen." Medals, but late. In 2001, nearly 60 years after World War II, the United States government awarded Congressional Gold Medals to the original 29 Navajo Code Talkers and silver medals to those who followed. The ceremony was historic and bittersweet. Elders stood where young men once had. Wrinkled hands received medals meant for soldiers who had crawled through jungles and transmitted messages under fire. Families watched with pride, some learning for the first time what their fathers and grandfathers had done. But the question lingered: why did it take so long? Cultural pride reclaimed. Despite the delay, recognition brought healing. For the Navajo Nation, the Code Talkers became symbols of resilience and cultural strength. Their story inspired younger generations to take pride in their language and heritage. Schools began teaching Navajo history with renewed respect. Museums created exhibits. Films and books told the story that had once been silenced. The language that was nearly erased had helped save the world. Ending of Batch 3. Transition to Legacy. The Navajo Code Talkers fought two wars, one against an enemy overseas and another against silence at home. Their heroism extended far beyond the battlefield, carried in quiet dignity for decades. But history has a way of revealing truth, even when it takes time. Their legacy was no longer hidden, and the world was finally ready.
Section 4. Lasting Legacy. A secret that rewrote military history. Long before computers, satellites, and encrypted digital networks, the U.S. military learned a profound lesson in the Pacific theater of World War II. The strongest code is not always built by machines. It can be carried by people. The Navajo Code Talkers did more than help win battles. They permanently changed how the United States and eventually the world thought about secure communication in warfare. Military historians now agree on one critical fact. Without the Navajo Code Talkers, the Pacific War would have lasted longer and cost far more lives. Their success reshaped military doctrine at a fundamental level. Speed that saved lives. Before the Navajo Code, encrypted messages often took hours to encode and decode. In fast-moving combat situations, delays meant disaster. The Navajo Code Talkers changed everything. Messages that once took 30 minutes to encode were now transmitted and understood in less than 20 seconds. Commanders could react instantly. Artillery could be redirected. Reinforcements could arrive before it was too late. At the Battle of Iwo Jima alone, Code Talkers transmitted over 800 flawless messages in the first 48 hours. Not a single one was intercepted or decoded by the enemy. That level of speed and accuracy had never existed before in modern warfare. Influence on modern cryptography. Though the Navajo Code itself was never reused after World War II, its principles became foundational to modern cryptographic thinking. Military strategists learned human-based encryption can outperform mechanical systems. Cultural complexity can be a strategic asset. Language diversity is a form of national security. These lessons influenced Cold War intelligence strategies, including how the U.S. approached code development, psychological operations, and information warfare. The Code Talkers proved that culture itself could be weaponized, ethically, defensively, and brilliantly. From margins to the center of American history. For much of U.S. history, Native Americans were excluded from the national narrative, treated as footnotes rather than foundational contributors. The Navajo Code Talkers shattered that pattern. Their story forced America to confront a powerful contradiction. A nation built on freedom had nearly erased the very cultures that helped defend it during its darkest hour. As their story became public, textbooks changed. Military academies added case studies. Museums created permanent exhibits. The Code Talkers were no longer invisible. They became central to the American story of World War II. Cultural revival through recognition. Perhaps the most profound legacy of the Code Talkers was not military, it was cultural. For decades, indigenous languages across the United States were endangered. Younger generations were discouraged from speaking them. Navajo was no exception. But when America learned that Navajo had defeated one of the most sophisticated military intelligence systems of the 20th century, something shifted. Language was no longer seen as a liability. It became a source of pride. Enrollment in Navajo language programs increased. Elders were invited into classrooms. Children learned that their ancestors' words had helped shape world history. The Code Talkers helped rescue a language from extinction simply by proving its power. Heroes without ego. Despite growing recognition, one thing never changed: the humility of the Code Talkers themselves. When asked about their service, many responded simply, "We did what needed to be done." They did not boast, they did not demand recognition. They believed duty spoke louder than praise. This humility resonated deeply with Americans. In a world increasingly focused on individual glory, the Code Talkers represented something rare: collective sacrifice rooted in cultural identity. Hollywood, but finally honest. As their story gained attention, filmmakers and authors began telling it on a larger scale. Unlike many earlier portrayals of Native Americans, these stories centered intelligence, discipline, and agency. The Code Talkers were not side characters, they were the reason missions succeeded.
Films, documentaries, and books helped introduce their legacy to millions, especially younger generations who had never heard of them before. For many Americans, this was the first time they learned that Native Americans played a decisive role in winning World War II. A lesson for the future. The Navajo Code Talkers left behind more than medals or monuments. They left a lesson for future generations. A nation is strongest when it embraces all of its people. Diversity is not weakness, it is resilience. Culture is not something to suppress, it is something to protect. In a time of global conflict, America found strength in one of its oldest cultures. That truth continues to resonate today in an era defined by information warfare and cultural identity.
The men behind the code. History often remembers systems, strategies, and outcomes, but wars are won by people. Behind the Navajo Code were young men, many barely out of their teens, who carried radios heavier than their own bodies, whispered ancestral words into microphones while bullets tore through the air, and made decisions in seconds that shaped the fate of thousands. This is where the story becomes deeply human. A boy from the reservation. One code talker grew up herding sheep on the high desert plains of Arizona. His childhood was shaped by dawn chores, stories told by firelight, and a language spoken with reverence. He had never seen the ocean. He had never left the reservation. When he enlisted, he could not imagine jungles, machine gun fire, or explosions that shook the ground beneath his feet. On his first night in combat, he wrote in his journal, not in English, but in Navajo, because English could not carry the weight of what he felt. Fear, responsibility, purpose. He knew that if his voice failed, men would die. Near death in the jungle. During a night operation on Saipan, enemy artillery found their position. Shells exploded within yards. A code talker and his radio operator dove into a shallow foxhole. Dirt rained down. Shrapnel tore through the air. The radio was damaged. The antenna was bent. The message had to be sent. Under fire, he straightened the antenna with his bare hands and transmitted the coordinates anyway. His voice never wavered. Minutes later, American artillery answered, precise, devastating, decisive. The attack stopped. Later, he realized shrapnel had sliced through his helmet. An inch lower, and the story would have ended there. The burden of accuracy. For a code talker, a single mistranslated word could mean friendly fire. There was no margin for error. One veteran later said, "Other Marines carried rifles, we carried lives." They memorized hundreds of coded terms, no notebooks, no cheat sheets, everything lived in their minds. Exhaustion, hunger, fear, none of it could be allowed to interfere. In moments of extreme stress, some code talkers silently recited Navajo chants before speaking into the radio, grounding themselves in tradition before transmitting death-defying information. Guarded by their own. In a tragic irony, some code talkers were misunderstood for Japanese soldiers because of their appearance. To prevent accidental killings, they were sometimes assigned bodyguards, American Marines ordered to protect them at all costs. This meant one thing: if capture seemed imminent, the code talker could not fall alive into enemy hands. The weight of that reality was never spoken aloud, but it was always understood. Witnesses to horror. They saw things that haunted them forever. Friends lost in seconds, medics overwhelmed, islands turned into graveyards. Yet even in the face of overwhelming loss, the radio never went silent. Orders still had to be sent, positions still had to be relayed. The code did not pause for grief. Moral dilemmas. Some code talkers struggled with a deep internal conflict.
Navajo culture traditionally valued harmony and balance. War demanded destruction. Reconciling these worlds was not easy. One veteran said years later, "I prayed in Navajo for forgiveness after every battle." Yet they understood that stopping the war sooner would save lives on both sides. That belief carried them through moments of doubt. Brotherhood under fire. What sustained them was each other. They shared jokes in Navajo that only they could understand. They teased, encouraged, and protected one another. In a world defined by violence, their language became a sanctuary. Even under fire, a few Navajo words exchanged quietly could restore courage. The cost that followed them home. Long after the war ended, the memories remained. Some code talkers woke in the night hearing radios that weren't there. Others avoided crowds, loud noises, or fireworks. But because their service was classified, many never sought help. They bore their pain silently, just as they had borne their heroism. Why these stories matter? These men were not symbols when they fought. They were human beings making impossible choices under unimaginable pressure. Their courage was not loud, it was steady, precise, unbreakable. The code worked because they did. From World War to World View. When World War II ended, the Navajo Code Talkers returned home quietly, but the ripple effects of what they had done did not end with the war. Their contribution reshaped not only military strategy, but America's understanding of identity, intelligence, and power. What began as an emergency wartime experiment became a lesson the United States would carry into every conflict that followed. A blueprint for future wars. During the Cold War, military planners faced a new enemy: secrecy, speed, and nuclear-level consequences. Communication security was no longer about hours, it was about seconds. Though technology advanced rapidly, one truth endured. No machine had ever matched the reliability of the Navajo Code. Military academies studied the Code Talkers not to replicate the language, but to understand why it worked. Zero written records, cultural context outsiders could not grasp, human intuition under pressure, redundancy layered inside meaning. These principles quietly influenced classified encryption philosophies for decades. Human intelligence over machines. As computers entered warfare, many believed technology would replace human intelligence. The Code Talkers proved the opposite. They showed that humans can adapt faster than algorithms in chaos. Cultural knowledge can outmaneuver pure mathematics. Trust between soldiers matters as much as encryption. This lesson resurfaced in later conflicts, from Korea to Vietnam, where human interpreters, cultural advisors, and linguists became critical assets. A turning point for Native American identity. Before World War II, Native Americans were often portrayed in American media as relics of the past. The Code Talkers destroyed that narrative. Here was undeniable proof. Native Americans were not just part of U.S. history, they were essential to its survival. This recognition triggered a slow but profound shift. Greater respect for Native military service, increased Native enlistment, policy discussions around tribal sovereignty. The Code Talkers had forced America to see what it had long ignored. Language as national security. Perhaps the most revolutionary legacy was this idea: language is power. After the Code Talkers story became public, linguists and defense experts warned that the loss of native languages wasn't just cultural, It was strategic. Languages carry unique logic systems, alternative ways of thinking, mental frameworks machines cannot easily mimic. The near erasure of native languages now appeared not only tragic, but dangerous. Cultural survival becomes resistance. For Navajo elders, the story of the Code Talkers became a rallying cry. Teaching the language was no longer just tradition, it was resistance. Communities began documenting oral histories. Schools reintroduced Navajo instruction. Youth were told not to abandon their language, but to protect it. The same words once banned in classrooms had defeated an empire. Influence on global military thinking. The impact reached beyond the United States. Allied nations studied the Code Talkers as an example of asymmetric advantage, how smaller, culturally unique systems can overpower technologically advanced enemies. In modern military theory, this concept is known as cognitive warfare, winning not by firepower alone, but by controlling meaning, perception, and understanding. The Navajo Code Talkers were pioneers of this idea long before the term existed. An unlikely symbol of unity. In a nation often divided by race, culture, and history, the Code Talkers became a rare point of unity. Their story transcended politics. Conservatives praised their patriotism. Progressives recognized the injustice they endured. Veterans honored their service. Educators taught their legacy. For once, America listened together. Lessons for a digital age. In an era of cyber warfare, artificial intelligence, and surveillance, the Code Talkers offer a timeless warning. Technology can be hacked, systems can fail, but culture, when protected, can endure. Their legacy asks a powerful question. What knowledge are we losing today that we may desperately need tomorrow?
When heroes grow old, time is undefeated. The young men who once sprinted across Pacific beaches with radios on their backs eventually became elders, walking slower, speaking softer, carrying memories heavier than any equipment they once wore. As decades passed, the number of living Navajo Code Talkers began to shrink. Their reunions grew quieter. Empty chairs appeared where brothers once sat. America was finally listening, but the storytellers were fading. Living with memory. In their later years, many Code Talkers spoke publicly for the first time. Schools invited them. Museums recorded their voices. Children listened wide-eyed as elders described battles that sounded almost unreal. But speaking did not erase memory. Some paused mid-sentence, eyes distant, reliving moments no words could fully capture. Others smiled gently, focusing not on fear, but on duty. They rarely described themselves as heroes. They described themselves as survivors. The first funerals. When the first Code Talkers began to pass away, their funerals were deeply symbolic. Navajo traditions blended with military honors. Drums echoed alongside rifle salutes. Prayers were spoken in the same language that once carried orders across war zones. Each funeral was a reminder a living library was being lost. Families mourned not only fathers and grandfathers, but history itself. A nation finally stands still. As awareness grew, so did respect. Flags were lowered. Governors attended services. Presidents mentioned Code Talkers in speeches. For a nation that once ignored them, this attention came late, but it came sincerely.
One elder said quietly, "We waited a long time, but at least now they know who we were." Monuments of stone and silence. Across the United States, memorials began to rise. In Arizona and New Mexico, stone monuments engraved with Navajo words stood beneath open skies. In Washington, D.C., exhibitions displayed radios, photographs, and handwritten notes. Yet the most powerful memorials were not physical. They were moments of silence when Americans realized how close history had come to forgetting these men entirely. Passing the responsibility. As their numbers dwindled, the Code Talkers understood a truth. Soon there would be no one left to speak firsthand. So they entrusted their story to others, to teachers, historians, children, and grandchildren. They urged young Navajo people to learn the language, to remember its power. One Code Talker told a classroom, "Our words protected this country once. They may need to do it again, just in a different way." The last voices. In the final years, interviews became rarer, health declined, voices trembled. When the last of the original Code Talkers passed away, headlines appeared across America. For many citizens, it was the first time they realized these men had still been alive. Too late, some wondered. Why didn't we listen sooner? A generation closes. With their passing, a chapter of history closed forever. No reenactment could replace their voices. No textbook could capture their silence. No medal could equal their sacrifice. What remained was responsibility. How America remembers them today. In the modern United States, the Navajo Code Talkers are no longer hidden figures. Their story has moved from classified documents into classrooms, museums, and national memory. But remembrance did not come automatically. It was fought for, preserved, and passed down deliberately. Today, school children across America learn that victory in World War II did not come only from generals and machines, but from culture, language, and human ingenuity. And that lesson matters more than ever. From silence to curriculum. For decades, American textbooks barely mentioned Native Americans after the 19th century. The Code Talkers changed that. Their story became a turning point in how history was taught. Native Americans were no longer portrayed only as victims or relics. They were shown as strategists, contributors, and defenders of democracy. Educational programs now use the Code Talkers to teach World War II history, linguistics and cryptography, cultural preservation, ethical responsibility in warfare. In Navajo schools especially, this history reshaped identity. Children learned that their language was not just something to protect, it was something that had once protected the world. Museums as memory keepers. Museums became guardians of the Code Talkers' legacy. Visitors can now see original radios used in combat, handwritten Navajo code notes, uniforms worn on Pacific Islands, recorded voices of Code Talkers telling their own stories. These exhibits do more than inform. They confront visitors with a difficult truth. America nearly lost this history by ignoring the people who made it. Every artifact is a reminder of how fragile memory can be. Pop culture finally catches up. For much of the 20th century, Hollywood erased Native Americans or reduced them to stereotypes. The Code Talkers challenged that pattern. Films, documentaries, and novels began to portray Native Americans as intelligent, strategic, and central to victory. Though imperfect, these representations opened doors. They sparked curiosity. They led audiences to ask questions and then seek real history. For many Americans, pop culture became the entry point to a deeper truth. Veterans honoring veterans. Among military communities, the Code Talkers occupy a special place. Modern soldiers study their tactics. Communication officers learn their story as a lesson in adaptability. Veterans see in them a reflection of duty without recognition. At military ceremonies, when Code Talkers' names are spoken, silence often follows, not out of ignorance, but respect. They represent the purest form of service, mission first, ego last. National identity reconsidered. The story of the Navajo Code Talkers forces America to confront itself. It asks, who do we value? Whose contributions do we remember? What knowledge do we ignore at our own risk? In an increasingly diverse nation, their legacy offers a roadmap. Unity does not require sameness. Strength comes from difference. The Code Talkers did not abandon their identity to serve America. They served because of it. Why their story still matters. In a digital age dominated by algorithms, automation, and artificial intelligence, the Navajo Code Talkers deliver a timeless warning. Human creativity cannot be replaced. Culture cannot be mass-produced. Wisdom passed down orally can outlast the most advanced machines. Their story matters not because it is old, but because it is relevant. The emotional core. At its heart, this story is not about war. It is about a language nearly erased, a people long ignored, and a moment when both became indispensable. The Navajo Code Talkers remind us that history often hides its greatest heroes in plain sight.
When words outlive war. Long after the final gunshot echoed across the Pacific, long after the flags were lowered and the uniforms folded away, something remained. Words. Not written in ink, not stored in machines, but carried in memory, spoken, protected, and passed down. The Navajo Code Talkers proved something history had never fully understood before. Language itself can change the fate of the world. The quietest victory. No enemy surrender document mentioned the Navajo language. No battlefield map marked its importance. Yet without it, entire operations would have failed. Entire battalions might never have returned home. The victory the Code Talkers achieved was silent but absolute. Not once during World War II was the Navajo Code broken. Not once. In a war defined by intelligence failures and catastrophic miscalculations, that fact alone sets their achievement apart from everything else. What the world almost lost. It is difficult to confront this truth. The same language that helped win the Pacific War was once targeted for destruction. Navajo children were punished for speaking it. Families were pressured to abandon it. Policies attempted to erase it. Had those efforts succeeded completely, the code would never have existed. History would have taken a different path. The survival of the Navajo language was not just cultural, it was strategic, accidental, and miraculous. The meaning of patriotism. The Navajo Code Talkers redefined patriotism. They served a nation that had often failed them. They defended freedoms they themselves were denied. They protected a country that had tried to silence their identity. And yet, they served without hesitation. Not because they forgot who they were, but because they remembered. Their patriotism did not come from obedience, it came from responsibility.
A message to the future. The Code Talkers leave behind a message for future generations, especially in an age obsessed with speed, technology, and automation. They remind us, human intelligence matters. Cultural knowledge matters. Diversity is not decoration, it is defense. What we preserve today may save us tomorrow. What we silence today may be the very thing we need most. Why this story ends but never finishes. Every time a student learns about the Code Talkers, it begins again. Every time a Navajo child speaks their language with pride, it continues. Every time a nation chooses inclusion over erasure, it echoes. The war is over, the radios are silent, but the legacy is alive. Final reflection. Some heroes charge forward with weapons. Some lead armies. Some change the world simply by speaking. The Navajo Code Talkers stood at the intersection of culture and courage, and history will never be the same because of it. They did not shout, they did not boast, they spoke, and the world listened, even if it took time. One language, once nearly erased, turned into the strongest code the world has ever known. This is not just a story of war, it is a story of survival, of identity, of voices that refuse to disappear. And as long as those words are remembered, the Navajo Code Talkers will never truly be gone. If you believe untold American heroes deserve to be remembered, follow this page and subscribe now. Powerful stories like this are waiting for you.